The day I found out I was holding a bag of groceries. That's the detail nobody ever asks about, but it's the one I can't shake. A paper bag, milk, bread, some pasta my wife had texted me to pick up that morning. I remember standing in the doorway of my own house, groceries in one arm, keys still in my other hand, watching my wife scramble off the couch and pull a throw blanket around herself while the man sitting next to her, my business partner of 6 years, slowly, deliberately, reached over and picked up his coffee mug like I'd just interrupted a board meeting. He didn't even stand up. And that's the part that took me the longest to process, not the blanket, not my wife's face. The fact that Victor didn't stand up. I set the groceries down on the floor just inside the door. I don't remember making that decision. My wife was saying something, my name, some version of an explanation. But I was looking at Victor, and Victor was looking at me over the rim of his mug. And there was something in his eyes that wasn't guilt. It wasn't even discomfort. It was closer to amusement. Like he'd been waiting for this scene and was mildly curious how I'd handle it. I turned around and walked back out. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I needed to know how long it took for my hands to stop shaking. My name is Thomas. I'm 51 years old, and at the time this happened, I had been married for 14 years to a woman I'll call my wife. Because even now, even after everything, calling her by her name in public feels like something I'm not ready to do. We had 2 kids, a house in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, and a landscaping and property management company I'd built from a single truck and a hand spreader into something with 12 employees and a fleet of vehicles. Victor came into the picture 8 years ago. He was a contractor I'd used a few times, reliable, sharp, knew how to talk to clients. When I was looking to expand, he approached me about a partnership. He'd bring in capital and a commercial client base he'd been cultivating. I'd bring the operational infrastructure. We shook hands, then we signed papers, and for 2 years it worked well enough that I stopped looking at the details as closely as I should have. My wife had introduced us, actually. They'd gone to the same college, lost touch, reconnected at some neighborhood thing before I'd ever met him professionally. I thought nothing of it. Why would I? That evening I drove to my brother-in-law's place. My brother-in-law on my side, not hers. And I slept on his couch without explaining much. He's the kind of man who hands you a beer and doesn't ask questions until you're ready. And I was not ready for 3 days. On the 4th day I called a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer yet. A business attorney. Because somewhere in those 3 days on that couch, staring at his ceiling at 2 a.m, something had clicked into place. Victor hadn't looked guilty. Victor had looked like a man who knew something I didn't. And men who look like that, in my experience, are men who've already made moves. I told my attorney, a woman named Helen who'd handled some contract disputes for me in the past, that I needed her to pull every document with my signature on it from the past 3 years and put them in front of me. She gave me a look. I told her it was urgent. She told me to come in the next morning. What she found over the next 2 weeks rearranged everything I thought I understood about my life. The partnership agreement we had signed, the one I'd reviewed and signed 8 years ago, had been amended. Not obviously, not crudely, but there was a clause added to a revised version filed 18 months earlier that I had no memory of signing. It restructured the equity split in the event of a buyout or dissolution, shifting majority control to Victor. There was a signature on it that looked like mine. Helen compared it to a dozen documents with my verified signature and told me, carefully, that she thought it was worth bringing in a forensic document examiner. It was a forgery. And that wasn't the end of it. There were 2 vendor contracts, large commercial accounts that represented about 40% of our annual revenue, that had been quietly renegotiated, with Victor listed as the sole operating partner. My name had been removed. The clients had been told I was stepping back from day-to-day operations. One of them told me later, when I called him personally, that Victor had told them I was dealing with a health situation and had voluntarily transferred my interest. I'd been running my own company without knowing someone had already stolen it from me on paper. Helen told me to keep going to work, act normal, and let her build the documentation before I said or did anything. I did that for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of showing up to job sites, talking to my guys, looking at trucks with my company's name on the side, and knowing that a man had forged my signature and was walking around believing he had already won. Victor was not subtle about his confidence. He started showing up to the office later, taking longer lunches. In our Monday meetings, which were now sometimes just us and sometimes included my wife, who had recently started attending in a capacity neither of them had ever fully explained to me, he would speak over me, not aggressively, just casually, the way you interrupt someone you've already stopped taking seriously. My wife had begun to look at me differently too. She was careful about it. But I'd been married to her for 14 years, and I knew the architecture of her expressions. There was a new version of patience in her face when she looked at me. The kind of patience you have with someone you're planning to leave. The day it broke open started on a Tuesday. My wife had a lunch meeting. She told me it was with a client of hers. She did event planning work on the side, and she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just walking by. But she'd gotten a notification and the preview was visible on the screen and the name at the top of the email thread was Victor's. I stood there for a long moment. Then I took a photo of the screen with my phone. I sent it to Helen. She called me within an hour. The email preview, just those two visible lines, referenced a meeting with someone named Arnold at a date 3 days from then. Helen recognized the name. Arnold was a commercial real estate attorney with a reputation for handling business dissolutions. They were planning to formalize the takeover. Not divorce proceedings yet. That would come after, once the business was secured. Victor had apparently calculated that a clean business seizure first would leave me with nothing to negotiate with. Helen said, very quietly, "Thomas, I need you to listen to me. We have 3 days." What happened in those 3 days is something I'll be grateful for until I die. Helen had already been in contact with a forensic accountant and the document examiner. The forged amendment was solid. The ink composition was wrong for the date listed on the document, and the signature had measurable inconsistencies. More importantly, Helen had identified that 2 of the vendor contract reassignments had not been properly filed with the state, which meant they were legally void. The commercial clients were still, technically and legally, contracted with the company as it was originally structured, meaning with me. She filed an emergency injunction to freeze the business assets the morning of the day Victor and my wife were supposed to meet with Arnold. I found out later, from a friend of a friend, that Victor got the notification from his own attorney while he was parking his car outside Arnold's office. He sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes before driving away. He came to my house that evening. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was home. My kids were at my sister's for the week. I'd arranged that earlier, telling them their aunt wanted to see them, not wanting them anywhere near what I knew was coming. My wife was home, and Victor came to my house unannounced and knocked on the door like a man who still believed he was in control of what was happening. My wife let him in. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Victor looked at me and he said, and I will remember this sentence for the rest of my life. "You should have just taken the offer, Tom. You're not built for this." There had been no offer. I want to be clear, there had never been a formal offer. He was referring, I understood later, to a vague conversation we'd had maybe a year earlier, in which he'd suggested I might want to think about simplifying my role in the company. I had not taken it seriously. He apparently had taken my lack of response as an opportunity. He sat down at my kitchen table in my house and he laid out what he believed the situation was. That the amended agreement was valid, that the vendor transitions were complete, that I could walk away with some goodwill and a small settlement, or I could make it difficult and walk away with nothing. He said this in a reasonable tone, like he was doing me a favor, like I was a problem he was being generous enough to solve quietly. My wife stood near the counter. She didn't say anything. But she didn't leave the room either. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate you coming by. Helen will be in touch with your attorney in the morning." Victor's expression shifted. Not much. "But enough," he said. "Who's Helen?" And I told him. The next several months were not clean or fast or satisfying in the way that movies make conflict resolution look. I won't pretend they were. There were depositions, there were hearings, there were weeks where I couldn't sleep, and weeks where I ate badly, and weeks where I sat in Helen's office looking at documents I had to force myself to concentrate on. My kids knew something was wrong. I tried to be steady for them, and I was not always steady. My wife filed for divorce 4 weeks after the injunction. I had expected it. It still felt like something falling. Victor's attorney pushed back hard on the forgery claim. They argued that I had signed the amendment in question at a meeting I had simply forgotten, and that my memory was unreliable due to stress. The forensic document examiner spent 2 days on the stand. The ink was wrong. The pressure patterns were wrong. A certified handwriting expert flew in from Philadelphia. The signature was wrong. The amended agreement was declared invalid. The vendor contracts, already void on filing technicalities, were reinstated under the original company structure. Victor had to disgorge 14 months of revenue he had redirected. The number, when Helen put it in front of me, was larger than I'd expected. She said, without smiling, "People who think they've won, stop being careful." Victor pled to a reduced charge of document fraud and paid a civil settlement that I am not at liberty to disclose, but which was, to use Helen's exact word, significant. He lost his contractor's license. He does not work in this industry anymore. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in March, 14 months after I walked into my house carrying a bag of groceries. My wife got the settlement her attorney negotiated, which was fair. I don't say that with bitterness. The legal process did what it does, and I came out of it with the company intact, and the house, and, more than anything, a parenting arrangement that my kids seemed okay with. They are 12 and 9. They are doing better than I expected, which means they are doing better than I feared, which some days is the most I can ask for. What I didn't expect, and nobody tells you this, is how long it takes to stop feeling stupid. Not angry. Stupid. Because I walked past the signs for years, the late meetings. The way my wife would sometimes refer to Victor's opinions when we argued casually, like a citation. The way he'd started speaking for both of us in client meetings without my noticing the shift. I talked to a therapist for about 8 months. He told me something in our 3rd session that I kept coming back to. You didn't miss the signs because you were naive. You missed them because you trusted people you had good reason to trust. That's not a character flaw. That's just what trust costs sometimes. I think about that a lot. There's one more thing I want to say, because a lot of people who've heard pieces of this story want to know what the turning point felt like from the inside. It wasn't the injunction. It wasn't winning in court. It wasn't even the moment in my kitchen when I watched Victor's face change. The turning point was the 4th morning on my brother-in-law's couch when I called Helen instead of doing what everything in me wanted to do, which was drive back to my house and have a very different kind of conversation with Victor than the one I eventually had. I made one phone call instead. That's it. That was the whole thing. Everything that came after, the forensic accountant, the document examiner, the injunction, the depositions, the verdict, all of it came from that one decision to pick up the phone and think before I acted. I'm not saying I was noble. I'm saying I was lucky that I knew which phone to pick up. The company is mine now, fully. We just signed a contract with a hospital system in Central Ohio that will keep us busy for the next 3 years. I hired 2 more people last month. My truck still has the original logo on it. I thought about redesigning it after everything, but in the end, I kept it. It's my name on the door. It was always my name on the door. Nobody forged that. I've thought a lot about what actually undid Victor, and I don't think it was the forensic accountant, or the document examiner, or even Helen's injunction. I think it was the moment he decided he had already won. That's the thing about people who cut corners to get what they want. They stop being careful the second they believe the game is over. Victor forged my signature and renegotiated my contracts and rewrote my company on paper. And then he sat in my kitchen and told me I wasn't built for the fight ahead. He wasn't threatening me. He was informing me. He had already moved on in his mind to whatever came next. And that gap between what he believed and what was actually true is where everything he'd built fell apart. I'm not going to pretend I was smarter than him. I wasn't. Not in the way he understood intelligence. He was strategic. He was patient. He'd been planning this for at least 18 months before I walked in holding that bag of groceries. I was reactive. I was operating on instinct and grief and a kind of cold fury I hadn't known I was capable of. The difference wasn't ability. The difference was that when I finally understood what was happening, I made one decent decision. I called Helen instead of doing the thing I actually wanted to do, and then I let people who were better than me at their specific jobs do those jobs without interference. That's what I mean when I say intelligence saved me. Not cleverness. Not being the sharpest person in the room. I mean the intelligence to recognize what I didn't know, to find people who did know it, and to get out of the way. A lot of men in my position would have confronted Victor the moment they had proof. Would have shown up somewhere, said something, forced a scene. I understand that impulse completely. I had it every single morning for 3 weeks, but every morning I also thought about my kids, and about what it would mean for them if I made this personal instead of legal. And I picked up the phone instead of my keys. That's the discipline part. Not dramatic, not heroic, just choosing over and over the harder, quieter thing. And the moral piece, I keep coming back to this, is that Victor wasn't destroyed by me. He was destroyed by his own calculation. He looked at me and saw someone he could underestimate. He looked at a marriage and saw a distraction he could exploit. He looked at a company another man built from nothing and decided it was easier to steal than to build his own. Every one of those decisions was a choice he made freely, and every one of them had a cost that eventually came due. I didn't make that happen. I just stayed in the room long enough to watch it. My kids are doing okay. The company is growing. I still drive the same truck. Some mornings I pull out of the driveway, and I think about the version of this story where I didn't call Helen, where I let anger make the first move, where Victor walked out of that kitchen having gotten exactly what he planned for. That version exists. It was one phone call away from being real. I got lucky, and I was just disciplined enough to deserve the luck.